Wonderful, so wonderful is your unfailing love. Your cross has spoken mercy over me, over me. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no heart could fully know how glorious, how beautiful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Powerful, so powerful, your glory fills the skies. Your mighty works displayed for all to see, all to see. The beauty of your majesty awakes my heart to sing. How marvelous, how wonderful you are. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with this love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. You opened my eyes to your wonders anew. You captured my heart with this love. 'Cause nothing on earth is as beautiful as you. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Beautiful one I love, beautiful one I adore, beautiful one my soul must sing. Faithful love flowing down from the thorn-covered crown makes me whole, saves my soul, washes whiter than snow. Faithful love calms each fear, reaches down, dries each tear, holds my hand when I can't stand on my own. Faithful love, from above, came to earth to show the Father's love. And I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face, and Jesus is his name. Faithful love is a friend just when hope seems to end. Welcome face, sweet embrace, tender touch filled with grace. Faithful love, endless power, living flame, Spirit's fire, burning bright in the night, guiding my way. Faithful love, from above, came to earth to show the Father's love. And I'll never be the same, for I've seen faithful love face to face. Jesus is his name.
Good morning, ladies, and welcome to our Ladies Bible class. We are working through the book Compassion and Service, the Heart and Hands of the Messiah. This is the Freed Hardeman lectureship book. This is the one that was for the ladies track, with different women speaking specifically to the ladies. Today's lesson is on being generous, and Rosemary McKnight is the one who did that lesson. So before we get started, we're going to go ahead and have an announcement and then a word of prayer. So the announcement is, just remember, there's no class for the next couple of weeks. We will not have class for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll get back in that third week. And there will be announcements on the website and announcements, probably a phone call we'll send out to remind everybody the week that it started back up. So it'll be on our announcements, but just so you're aware, no class the next 2 weeks, and hopefully everybody has a happy holiday, and we'll get started with prayer. Father God, we're so thankful for this time. We're thankful for this lectureship that happens each year with faithful Christians getting together and studying your word. We're thankful for the book that's published so that we are able to benefit from it even when we cannot attend the lectureship. We are thankful for your word that we can hold in our hands. We are mindful of all the people that lived that didn't get to hold your word, and that we have so many copies in most households in the United States of the Bible. We can pull it up on our phones and our laptops, and we're just so thankful that it's so readily available. We're thankful for the lessons that we can learn. We're thankful for this congregation that meets here at Collinsville. We're thankful for the eldership that oversees this congregation. We're so thankful for Christian sisters, for that special relationship that we have. We're mindful of the needs in the congregation. We have members struggling with health and with finances and with all sorts of ongoing issues, with relationship struggles, and we are just mindful of all of that. We are so thankful for your Son who died on the cross for our sins. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. So this morning we are going to talk about being generous. This is a really good, it just keeps being so timely how we started this year. Our lessons keep being, we had gratitude right around Thanksgiving. Now here it is Christmas and we're having generous. So it's a time of year when most people are thinking about being generous. Most people want to be generous. And so we want to talk a little bit about what that looks like, what it means, and how we can be it. So generous means that we are showing a readiness to give more of something. That's what it really means. Do we think about that? About showing that readiness, that willingness, that I am ready and able to do this thing. And when we're talking about giving more of something, we're talking about giving our money, giving our time. Sometimes it can be giving our food or our belongings. You know, sometimes when there's maybe a fire, people bring clothes and household supplies and all sorts of things. So when we're generous, we are always looking for that opportunity to give more of ourselves, to give more of that time and that money. And it's not just giving more, it's more than is strictly necessary or expected. So when I'm generous, I'm going to be giving even more. And so if I'm a Christian and I'm going to be generous, how much generosity does God expect for his people to give? If I'm really going to be a generous person, I'm going to try to give even more than what the expected is. So we might have kind of a baseline for what's expected, and being generous means I'm always going to be trying to go above that. I'm going to be giving even more of myself. Generous comes from the Latin generosus, and it actually, when it was the Latin translation, just means magnanimous, great, right? So when we are being generous, we are greatly doing something. And I think that's really interesting that the Latin is so, because we literally take the word, right, generosus, right straight to generous. And so magnanimous giving is basically what it is. When I am ready, that means that I am prepared for that purpose. So if I'm going to prepare myself for the purpose of giving, then part of what I have to do is recognize the needs around me. I'm not ready to give if I don't see who needs giving to. When I give, it means that I freely transfer possession of something to someone. So when I'm giving my time, I am freely giving my time willingly to this other thing. If I give my money, then I'm freely giving it, right? We do see sometimes in society where people hold on to the purse strings. They give, but it has caveats. But generally speaking, when you donate to a cause, you're saying you spend it however you're going to spend it, right? We don't tend to specify how our dollars are going to go. When I give, it means to devote, to set aside, to sacrifice for a purpose. And so when we're talking about being generous, these are the things we want to keep in mind. We want to think about how it is sacrificial, how I have to be purposeful, I have to be ready, I have to be willing. I'm going to give more than what's expected, more than what's necessary. I'm going to think about what it is I'm giving, because there are so many things. I cannot have very much money and still give to all sorts of things, to all sorts of people. And there is nothing better to give to than people, right? People give to all sorts of causes, and certainly some of them can be good. We can give, people donate at zoos to animals and to things like the SPCA, and those are good, beneficial causes. It wouldn't be wrong to put a little bit of your money toward that, but we want to be sure that what we are the most generous with is other people, human beings. And so we want to have those needs in our mind, and we want to freely do it, where we are not with expectation for a return, right? When I give, I'm not giving a loan where I expect repayment. I'm giving something that I never expect to see given back to me. So she starts with this quote, and this will be familiar probably to everybody, even if you've never ever read the book. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, it was a season of light, it was a season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. And that is, of course, A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens. And just as a side note, if people are readers and they are only reading modern things, if you've never read Dickens, go ahead and pick up some of his books, because you won't be disappointed. His books are quite amazing. So just as a side note, if you actually like to read and you haven't read his work, then go ahead and do it, because they are really good. So these are the words of the opening lines of Charles Dickens' classic novel, but she says it could very well be a description of the two characters that Jesus talks about in the book of Luke. If one were to ask the rich man that Jesus described in the parable of Luke 12 how his life was going, he probably would have replied, "It's the best of times. My life is producing more abundantly than I could have dreamed. My crops are so bountiful that I'm going to have to tear down barns and build bigger ones. Life doesn't get much better than this. I'm taken care of for years to come. It's time to relax and enjoy life. Let's just eat, drink, and be merry." But on the other hand, if one were to ask that widow how her life was going, she might have responded, "It is the worst of times. My husband has died and I am so lonely. I have no income and I have just given my last 2 coins to the temple. I don't know how I'm going to live." And that is really how it is in the world around us, right? We don't know when we encounter different people whether they might be in the best of times or the worst of times. There's a meme that's going around right now, and it says for some of us, this is the season of merrymaking. This is the season of joy. And it's time of get-togethers and of good food and fellowship and presents galore. But for other people, this is a season of grief. This is a season of sorrow. They're living their very first holiday without that family member that they loved so much. And so for everybody, it's not the season of merry. And we need to be very careful that we remember that. And that around us, people are going through all these different things. So we want to be mindful of that, because people probably forgot about this widow a little bit. They probably didn't forget about this rich man, because they could see his barns. They could see him in town with his clothes and his things. But they probably did forget about this widow a little bit. They probably weren't thinking too much of her. And even her family and friends might have kind of forgotten how she was doing. Because a lot of times people, right when the death of the family happens, they think of it, but then everybody else kind of moves on with their lives. And as Christians, we want to remember those people and not just move on with our lives. We want to be sure we're paying attention to people around us, because when we're talking about being generous, one of those most important things we can be generous with are the things that are free. We can be generous with our smiles and our hugs and with our time and with our listening. Those are all free to give and don't cost a single penny. And so we want to be sure we're trying to do that. But she says, was it really the best of times and the worst of times for these two? Let's examine them a little closer. So we're going to turn to Luke chapter 12. We're going to read verses 13 through 21. So she says, and one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. And he said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? And he said unto them, Take heed, beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And he spake a parable unto them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, This will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater. There will I bestow all my fruits and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, Thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then who shall these things be which thou hast provided? So is he that layeth up treasure for himself, and is not rich toward God. And he said unto his disciples, Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, neither for your body what you shall put on. The life is more than meat, and the body is more than raiment. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which neither have storehouse nor barn, and God feedeth them. How much more are you better than some fowls? And which of you, with taking thought, can add to his stature 1 cubit? If he then be not able to do that thing which is least, why take ye thought for the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They toil not, they spin not. And yet I say unto you that Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed as one of these. If then God so clothe the grass, which is this day in the field, and tomorrow cast into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O ye of little faith? And seek not what ye shall eat, what ye shall drink, neither be ye of doubtful mind. For all these things do the nations of the world seek after, and your Father knoweth that you have need of these things. But rather, seek ye the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. So the bounty of the farmer's harvest overflowed and blessed that man with material blessings. By the world's standards, it was the best of times. He had everything he needed, right? He was fed, he was clothed. When he talks about eating, drinking, and being merry, he had people around him. But we can see these terms of foolishness and incredulity, darkness and despair. He was foolish because he focused entirely on himself. She says, circle the times that the man used the word I or my. So we're going to read those verses again, 17 through 19. And he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, and be merry. 11 times. That's how many times in those 2 verses alone that he said I or my. How often do we say I or my? Hopefully some of our sentences at least include other people. But I fear that sometimes people are focused on that. I, me, my. This man was foolish because he did not acknowledge the source of his blessings. He never mentioned that God had been good to him, generous to him. He never thanked God for the abundance that he had been given. If I have an abundance, I have plenty. I have plentifulness of the good things of life. I have prosperity. If we are careful looking at our blessings, we've talked about this before, if we keep a careful track, I know that every person that's in this congregation can list an abundance of blessings, no matter what's going on in life, because we do have so much. Again, it's not about your possessions. It's not about how many things you own or how large your house is, or do you have 3 or 4 cars sitting in the driveway. It's about other things too. And if we recognize that, then we would be much more content. And contentness breeds joy. So we need to be careful with that. She says a fool is someone who dismisses God. Someone so caught up in the world that they are focused on themselves, their possessions, and their pleasure rather than on any spiritual things. And if that is the definition of the fool, then there are a lot of fools in the world. We want to be careful as Christians that we are not that same way, focused on only self, on possessions, on material gain, on the pleasures of the world. She said, as for the rich in the present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. 1 Timothy 6:17. This man was foolish. He was blind to the needs of others. He never once mentioned using any of his blessings to help others. He gave, as far as we're told in this passage, nothing. He gave nothing. His life was the exact opposite of generosity. It was a life of selfishness and a life of pleasure. And so it was the winter of despair when his life was taken. He couldn't take his possessions with him. He had built barns on earth, but he didn't build a mansion in heaven. And that's not a good place to find yourself in. So he closes this parable with, so the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. I I don't know about you, but I would rather be rich toward God than rich here on this earth. And I think that there is a good lesson in this parable when we remember that parables contain a lesson, if we remember that about materialism and greed. So I want to be sure that I'm building that mansion in heaven and that I'm thinking of others and putting others' needs in my mind. So then we go to the poor widow, and so that's going to be in Luke chapter 20. Let's see. So there are widows who would probably agree that losing a spouse is the worst of times. The widow that Jesus observed gave her last 2 coins. She knew sorrow. She knew hard times. She didn't have any life insurance policies. She didn't have any Social Security check coming in the mail to give her any kind of help financially. In addition to her poverty, Jesus mentioned the scribes who devoured widows' houses. So they weren't taking care of the widows because there were measures in place that were meant to be helping them, but people weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. Jesus had seen the way that the religious leaders disregarded the widows by not meeting their needs, but those same religious leaders were requiring the widows to come and to give at the temple. So Luke 21 is actually where we're going to be. Luke 20 was talking about the devouring the widows' houses and kind of the situation the widows were finding themselves in. So we're going to read Luke 21, 1 through 4. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw the poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." The loss of a spouse, the loss of her income, the loss of being neglected by those people who were supposed to be protecting her and caring for her, that would all point to the worst of times. But even in this time of suffering and sorrow, it was the epic of belief, the season of light, the spring of hope, because she gave anyway. She didn't stop and compare herself to those rich people who could give a large sum. She didn't even worry about how she was going to manage in the future. She showed her belief and her faith in God, and she gave. She gave sacrificially. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was a lot of faith because she believed that God was going to provide for her needs. When one gives themselves first to God, we're on page 126, about halfway down, giving comes naturally. For the widow and for us today, faith, contentment, and generosity bring forth the spring of hope. And I really love how Dickens describes the spring of hope versus the winter of despair, because which season follows which, right? Winter comes first and spring comes second. So we can have a winter of despair, but the story doesn't end there. That spring of hope is always coming. And if I'm a Christian, I have the biggest spring of hope that there is, because I have the hope of heaven. And there is no more beautiful springtime on the face of this planet that's going to rival and compare with the beauty of heaven, right? There's no more beauty than standing in God's presence. And so if I can think that, then it doesn't even matter what the winter of despair here is, because I have that eternal spring of hope as long as I'm living faithfully. So she said those people, the rich fool and the poor widow, were total opposites when it came to generosity. One of them had an abundance to give out of and didn't do it. The other had nothing to give out of. just a pittance is all she had. And she gave all that she had. So we have some lessons to be learned. She says the first lesson here is we must guard against greed. So greed is an intense, selfish desire for something, especially for wealth, power, or food. That's the dictionary definition of it. And so if something is intense, if we're feeling something intensely, you cannot ignore it, right? Selfish, self-motivated. So this is this unable to be ignored. You cannot avoid thinking about it. It is driving you. It is driving your choices. It is motivating your actions. And that's what greed will do. And for many, many people, greed for wealth or power especially do that to them. So that parable started with, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Luke 12:15. At the end of the parable, so he has that parable bookmarked, right, with these two things. At the end it says, so is with one who lays up for himself and is not rich toward God. So that parable is reminding us at the beginning that our abundance of possessions does not help us. Coveting what other people have, wanting that abundance of possessions is not going to help you. And then at the end, reminds us being rich toward God will help you. The rich fool found security in his possessions, but it was a false sense of security. He had no worries and he had no need for God. Greed and materialism are a poor substitute for God. Our possessions and our bank account do not make us rich in God's eyes, right? God is a respecter not of persons. We know that. We live in a nation where people value their possessions, where our worth is often based on the neighborhood we live in, the car we drive, the clothes we wear, the money in our bank accounts, the activities we can afford to do. How many children go to schools where they are judged on those very things? They don't have the right shoes on. They're not carrying the right notebook. They're not carrying the latest device. They don't have the right phone. They might not have any phone. And that causes real problems. That causes real sorrow, and it causes real resentment and bitterness and all sorts of feelings. And it doesn't end with childhood. It doesn't end with teenagehood. There are adults that are sitting and thinking the very same thing. Like that rich man, though, we can get so caught up in pursuing things that we neglect God and that we turn our back on others. We want bigger barns, right? Just like that rich fool had. We want the bigger barns. And as a result, we fail to be generous. So anybody who's known us for any amount of time knows that Jonathan and I are very big on personal stewardship and responsibility with finances, right? We certainly are not going to just spend crazily and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with setting aside for future. It's a good idea to do in this world, right? But if you are doing all of that to the exclusion of being generous, and you're not giving to other people, you're not seeing the people around you, then what good does that do? That doesn't do any good. So Christians can have responsibility with their finances. It is good to be a good steward of what you have. It is good to provide for your family. It is good to provide for your future. Somebody has to provide for your future, and so it is good to try to do those things. But if it comes at the expense of never being generous because you're setting every dollar to the side to do these other purposes, then that's not good planning. That's not good stewardship. So the next thing that she says that's a lesson we can learn is give what you can. So many people allow themselves to be limited. Oh, I can't give in a way that makes any real difference, so I just won't give at all. Well, if every single person who wanted to give to, say, a certain children's home only had $20 to give, but every single person gave the $20, how much benefit could that children's home do with that small amount? They don't need every person to give $1,000 that they can't give, but they do need every person to give in a way that they can give. And so if people think, and that often does happen, oh, I can't really afford to make a real difference, so I just won't give at all. There was a crisis last year with the giving. There are children in our own communities that need help, and last Christmas they were struggling to meet those needs. They were struggling to have people adopt those children and do the gifts for them, and that had never been a problem before, so they were rather confused by it in our area. And they did manage to solve it mostly by reaching out to congregations and businesses in the community. But that was because I think people were thinking, oh, I can't do that, so I won't do it at all. And if everybody says to themselves, I can't do quite as much as I'd like, so I won't do it at all, then no one is doing anything and no needs are being met. So we have to be careful that we don't get that kind of attitude, that we do just give what we can. When we compare ourselves with others who have so much more to give, and we think, well, what little I can give won't make a difference. But that isn't true. When we contribute collectively, that's when those efforts can be done. It is a beautiful thing to see Christians come together to give and see the benefits of their collective giving. Together, we can do more. That's a really good expression to keep in mind. If each Christian gives as they have been prospered, cheerfully as they have been prospered, then those funds can serve others, and those funds can spread the gospel. And then who gets the glory if the church is doing that? God, which is exactly how it's supposed to be. So we want to remember to give what we can. The next lesson, she says, is at the bottom of page 127. It is not how much we give, but how we give. Our attitude toward giving is what is important. Paul told the church in Corinth, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly, not under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. So I want to have the right attitude for giving. Generosity is not about an amount. It's not about saying, well, okay, I gave $1,000 to different things this last year. It's about the attitude, the simple sincerity, and the character behind giving. Christians should never give because they have to give. That's not our motivation. It's not because we have to. There is giving because we want to give. What has God given to me? That's what motivates my giving. There is joy in generosity. There is joy in helping others. There is joy in seeing those things done. The next thing that she says is that gratitude breeds generosity. If we don't have gratitude, we will never be generous givers. We are not going to be generous unless we are thankful for what we have in our own lives. When we realize that our possessions are gifts from God and that we are just merely stewards of those blessings, then we will share what we have with others. Being grateful helps us be generous. So if I want to cultivate generosity in myself, I have got to start first by cultivating gratitude in my life. I've got to be thankful for the things and the people in my life. So she says, what do you treasure? What is the most important to you? And a lot of times people will give an answer to that, but then their actions don't match their answer. They might say, I treasure my family above and beyond anything, but then they don't show that by putting their families first. So we want to be very careful when we think about our treasure and make sure that where we identify the treasure is also how we're living our lives. In Luke 12:33 and 34, it says, "Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in heaven that does not fail, where no thief approaches, no moth destroys, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Many people look at this verse backwards. They think our treasure reflects our heart, but Jesus told them to look at what they treasure because that's where their heart already is. So we need to think about that. She said, what if what you treasure is your house? Is that wrong to treasure your home? No, not if we use it for God's glory. We can be generous with our homes. She says we can open our homes in hospitality. We can welcome a new family to the congregation in for a meal. We can host a youth devotional there. We can feed a homesick college student away from their family. We can offer a bedroom to a visiting preacher or somebody who has a family member in a hospital in your city. We can let someone use our washer and dryer if they don't have one. We can open our home to those coming into town for a funeral. So many ways to be able to be generous with our homes. And she said, I really liked the thing she says here about halfway down the page. She said there was a lady who hosted a lot of people who would come to Scotland on mission trips. Her house was often crowded with guests, but she would say, our walls are elastic. There's always room for one more. So that's a really good attitude to have about your home. She says, do you treasure the money in your bank account? Plenty of people do. Plenty of people really, really value that amount that they have. God blessed you with that money. So how can you be a good steward and give it back to God? There's the weekly contribution, right? We have our offering, but there are other opportunities too. We can use our money. We can use our possessions to help others. Luke 3:11 says, whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none. Whoever has food is to do likewise. We have to help to feed the hungry and to clothe people who don't have clothing. Luke 6:30 tells us, give to everyone who begs from you, and from one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. So we want to help the needy. Luke 14:13 says, when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. Jesus told the rich young ruler in Luke 18:22 that he should sell all he had and distribute it to the poor. Then he would have treasure in heaven. Jesus wants us to be generous with the things we have. So another way to be generous is by giving our time. So again, we talked about, what if I'm like that widow? What if I just don't have a lot of money? And that can be true. We might not have a lot of money, but our time is a wonderful investment that we can always give. Jesus gave his time as he welcomed children, healed the sick, comforted the grieving, trained and taught, ate in people's homes. Jesus did not have money to give, but he was generous with something more precious, himself. He gave himself over and over, and he gave his time. We talked about that last week, right? When he was walking where he knew he was going to the cross, he still stopped and helped. He still listened to the blind man and restored his sight. And he knew where he was going, and he gave his time. There are times when others need the gift of our presence much more than they need our money. It takes time to visit the sick, the shut-ins, the newcomers to the community or the congregation, those who are lonely. It takes time to go to a visitation or a funeral. It takes time to comfort someone who's grieving. It takes time to take someone to a doctor's appointment or pick up a prescription. It takes time to babysit for someone who might need a date night. It takes time to write a note or a card of encouragement. It takes time. It takes time. It takes time to listen. One of the greatest gifts of time is the time that it takes to reach out to people who are lost, to tell them how they can be found, how they can be saved, to study the Bible with them and teach them. It takes time to teach a Bible class so that you can help people to grow in their faith. All of these things take time, and all of us have time. Even if we do not have money, we all have time, the same exact amount of time. So our money, our bank accounts look dramatically different from one another, but our time accounts look exactly the same. We each have the same amount of minutes in one given day. So one of the benefits of being generous with our time is that's exactly what it takes to build relationships. We cannot build a relationship with someone without time. We cannot strengthen bonds without giving time. We cannot learn about that other person and know them without investing time into them. If there are parents who invest no time in their children, then what tends to happen with that? Those children tend to be grown and to not feel invested in the relationship with their parent. Certainly, children make their own decisions as they grow, and they can have time invested in them and still choose to go away and not have any contact with their parents. But generally speaking, if a parent has invested time, then the children are going to invest time in their parents as their parents age. If time wasn't invested in marriage, then marriages tend to fall apart because those people tend to grow distant from one another rather than close. But marriages where time have been invested tend to grow closer together, and they tend to do that. So when we want to develop relationships, when we want to strengthen bonds, then we have got to put time into those relationships. God has also blessed us with talent. So we have talents. We all have talents. Everyone has some kind of a gift, some kind of a thing that they're good at, some kind of a service that they're excellent at giving. God has blessed us, and He wants us to use those talents. Walk through a church building during a ladies' day, and you will see evidence of women being generous with their talent. It might be a beautifully decorated bulletin board, tables adorned in lovely ways, songs that are led, graphic designs on the printed program, a challenging lesson delivered in love, or the meal prepared to feed the crowd. Every single one of those things took different time, different effort, different talents, different abilities. So she says, what is your talent? How can you use it generously? Sewing skills is a talent. Anything that goes along with that, knitting, crocheting, any of those kinds. Cooking, delivering the meals. Maybe you can't cook, but maybe you know a sister that's wonderful at cooking and you could offer to be the one that went and delivered the food. Maybe you have a beautiful voice, and she says you could use it to help to sing at funerals or weddings. If you have artistic talent, you can use that. You can prepare Bible class materials, illustrate books that teach about the Bible, paint murals in a hallway or a classroom, decorate handmade cards. There are talented women writers that write articles and blogs, devotionals, books. Maybe they're a writer that just writes letters and cards to people instead, and they never publish a single thing on a website or in a book. Talented teachers who week after week teach children in the congregation, who teach the women in the congregation. Luke 12:48 says, "Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. And from him to whom they entrusted much, they will demand more." We are blessed, and God expects us to be generous in return. So if we kind of revisit those things, we had treasure, which is kind of like our money, our possessions. We had our time, which we all have the same bank account for, and we have our talent. So we have very, very different ways that we can do that. We may have different levels of time, because certainly some people are more busy with other things. Maybe a family that still has small children in the home doesn't have quite the same time to do things as another family might, but maybe they're able to give in a different way. And so it might be that sometimes you're giving more of your talent and less of your treasure, and other times you might be giving more of your time and less of your talent. It just depends. And ideally, you're giving the most that you can in all three of those categories. So generosity begins by first giving ourselves to the Lord. When we realize that all of our blessings come from God and our gratitude is overflowing, then that's when we can share all of those blessings with other people. So on the questions, we don't always get to the questions, but we have a couple of minutes today. She says, my dad used to say, you can't outgive God. That's a very true statement. None of us can ever imagine being able to come close to outgiving God. So we want to think, she says, take the time, make a list of ways that God has been generous to you. If you made a list of just spiritual blessings alone and nothing else, not one single material blessing, not one single thing about a family member or a friend, and you only listed your spiritual blessings found in Christ, when you are in the church, when you are one of His, that list alone would take up pages, because that list alone overflows with blessings. So everybody who is a faithful Christian who has been baptized into Christ can make a huge list of blessings. And then when you go and you add to that list with other things, you will find that you have been given to so generously. So I think that probably would be a good thing for people to do this week if they had time. She says, give some examples of ways you have seen others being generous with their treasures, their time, their talent. And there are so many ways, and people are so creative with it. And if we really take the time to look around, one of my favorite things about social media is that you can be a part of groups with other Christians spread across the world, across the country, yes, but even across the world. And when you see some of these things that are done, I was reading the other day about Christians in India, because they still have leper colonies in India. So they were delivering the rice, but not just the rice, they were delivering, clothing and all sorts of things to these leper colonies. Leprosy, as we talked about a few weeks ago, is so much more treatable today. Antibiotics will treat. So leper colonies tend to be short-lived while they're undergoing. But the antibiotics take like a year, 2 years to work. And you take 2 to 3 antibiotics at a time. And so they still have to stay apart from other people in their families while they're undergoing that treatment. But these Christians that are there are reaching out to these people, because them visiting in a careful way doesn't put them in any danger of getting the leprosy, because you have to have over and over and over contact for it. But it brings them so much pleasure when people come into their leper colony community, and when they stay and take the time to sit down and have a meal with them. So getting to see things like that happening just remind you of the blessings that you have. I'm very thankful that I do not have leprosy, and that I do not have to live apart from my family and miss 2 whole years of time while I undergo treatment. So if you just pay attention to those things that are going on. I always love going to different ladies' days, because you can see different ideas, different examples of how people are giving in their communities. You can see where people are making the hats for the NICU babies, or where they're going and they're giving to schools, like we were able to do this past year with the backpacks full of supplies, where food is being given and clothing. A lot of congregations will do the coat drives, where they give good warm coats to people in need. So there are so many things, and sometimes if you don't talk to other people, then you don't know what kind of ideas might be out there, because maybe you haven't thought of it yet. And so it can help us to be more generous by paying attention to the generosity of others. So she says, what should our attitude toward money be? How do we apply verse 18 of 1 Timothy chapter 6? They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. So we have to keep that in mind too, about what should our attitudes as Christians be toward money. What kind of way do we want to have? What kind of relationship with money do we want to have? So there are so many, these question pages that we don't always have a chance to get to are so good for us to be able to take a look at and to think about. So the very last thing is we are going to be taking the 2-week break, which I said at the beginning. Our next lesson is on being purposeful, and we are going to be in Luke in several different chapters. Luke 12, Luke 18, and Luke 24 is where our next lesson is going to be. So I hope that everybody does have a good holiday, and I will see you 3 weeks from now.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Lord, reign in me, reign in your power, over all my dreams. In my darkest hour you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? You are the Lord of all I am. So won't you